Oh no, I've officially gone nuts! Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. Today we're working on the saw vise. This is the 5th video in the series, and there'll be one more after that where we're putting together the details needed for this large saw vise. If you'd like to follow along with the build, I do have plans on my website. I'll leave a link to those down below. As well as I have the full detailed videos taking this whole thing step by step so you can see every step of the process. You can see that video series. I'll leave a link to that playlist down below. So today we're going to be working on making these bolts. We have to cut the hole through here, thread one side, and then make a nut and bolt. Originally I was going to be making these out of maple, but I thought, you know, if I'm using black walnut pegs, why not use a black walnut nut? So this should be a fun video. Let's dive in. So now it's time to put a bolt through here so that we can clamp these together. And I'm going to put one on both sides. Does that mean you need to use both? No, most of the time the saws you're going to use are only going to be like that much of the actual vise. So you only need to use the one. But if you're working with a longer saw, what you can do is tighten down one, get it close to where it needs to be, and then you can crank down the other one and clamp up the other jaw. One will hold the saw in place. The second one just makes it tight a little bit farther along. So what I need to do is I need to drill through these two, and on this back one I'm going to cut in some threads. That way the bolt can actually go through. We're basically going to be making a bolt, and when we cut threads into this back one, that will become the nut. So what I want to do is drill a hole in this side that's the diameter of our dowel. And for that, I'm going to be using this piece of maple 1.5" dowel. This is a very straight grain dowel, and I really like it. Maple, because it's diffuse porous, holds the threads really nicely. So that's what I'm going to be using for the bolt. And basically, we're going to make a nut that then screws onto the end of the threaded bolt, and then we're going to glue that in place so it becomes a bolt with, you know, a head that you can turn with your hand. So the first thing we need to do is drill the hole through here. Now this one, I want it so that the threads, the rod, can slide through freely. On this back one, I want to make the hole a little smaller, and that way we can cut threads into that side. Now what I want to make sure is that those two holes are perfectly in line. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to drill a hole all the way through both of them to start with. If I were going to be using an auger bit, I'd probably want to use a smaller diameter bit, something like a 1/16, maybe as large as an 1/8, so that I have an identification connection point between them. But in this case, I'm going to be using a hole saw because I have them, and I don't have an auger that is 1 3/8 and 1.5 inches. Now I have an adjustable auger, but going through hickory, my adjustable auger, it takes a ton of work. Because it only has that one cutting blade, it's going to spin and slip and be a painful thing to do. Whereas a hole saw will work a lot better. So first thing I'm going to do is drill the pilot hole all the way through. And this shank is the same diameter as the shank in the middle of my hole saw, so that this will track in whatever hole that creates. On the vertical, I've also made a mark where I want it to be, so that it's, well, where I want it to be. I want it to be down far enough from the top of the jaw, so if I put in my big handsaw, the big handsaw isn't going to hit the threads inside. I'm also wanting to make sure I'm vertical as well as square to the surface, so I'm going to go in a little bit, and I'm going to occasionally just eyeball it. Doesn't need to be perfect, just good. And I can get pretty darn close that way. Now that I'm through the first side, I'm going to go straight over to the other side, and I'm going to make sure that I am both plumb and square still, and I'm going to start in on the other side. And again, these are just locating holes for the hole saw, so now that guide bit will fit into that hole, and I'll have a nice true cut. I can cut from this side and then cut from the other side and make sure that the two are still in line. So now that I have a pilot hole drilled, I can grab my hole saw, I can fit it into the pilot hole, put the butt into my chest, and crank it down. Is this the easiest and best way to do it? No. Does it work? Yeah. Ooh, there we go. Just like that. You've got a hole cut in it. Is it terribly pretty? No. A little bit of cleanup with a chisel, you can make that look really nice. Then after drilling out the front side, I can flip it around and put in the smaller bit. In this case, it's a 3/8 bit. This will be what I use for tapping. This is the back side, so I can put that in the hole. Second verse, same as the first, just with a slightly smaller hole this time. Now the next thing we need to do is thread off the bolt. And what I want is two pieces that are at least the thickness of this frame plus another inch. So in this case, that's 4 inches. Now just to make matters safe, I'm going to go about 5 inches. So I need about 10 inches of threads because I need to make 2 out of this. So I'm going to mark off about 10 inches and make sure that I thread off at least that much. Now I like to actually thread uphill. A lot of people like to turn this around and thread down on it, but the reason I like threading up is that I can slather this whole thing, and I just find it a little easier. If I'm ever using oil, the oil will then run downhill into the device, and I'm just going to use this paste wax to make this a little bit more slippery. It allows the threads to cut a little bit easier. Then I'm going to take a threading box, and one of these days I'm going to do a video on making one of these, but this is one I just purchased, and I'll leave a link to what I purchased down below. And it's just as simple as turning it on there. The first few threads are a little bit more difficult, as it's just got to work on there, but once you get a few threads in there, it takes care of the rest, and it drives itself up the dowel. And then I'm just going to go up to that mark I drew, which is right there, and we will have our bolt. And there we go. Now that I'm up to the top, then we just rotate it back down and take it off. Some people might cut it off and make it easier so you don't have to rotate this all the way back down. I find rotating it down just cleans up the threads a little bit, so I can move it all the way down. Got fairly nice clean threads, a lot better than I would have gotten using an oak dowel, which I've done in the past. So now let's cut this apart and make some bolts. Now the next thing I need to do is cut this to length, and I'm not going to worry too much about the exact length. I'll be fixing that later once we get to what exactly needs to be, and I'll trim it off. Basically, I want to cut this close to the end of the threads, and then I'm going to cut it in half. So I'll cut it here, and then I'm going to eyeball and estimate, that looks about half. I left myself with a good amount of leeway, about 1 inch on either end, so if I'm off by 1 inch, then my eyeball has problems. So the next step is to use a tap, and this thing has a T-handle on the end. It works just like you expect it to. You put it in there, you turn it, and you cut a thread. But what I'm going to do is actually put some paste wax on here. That'll allow this whole thing to slide through much easier. And occasionally I'll pull it out, and I'll work on some more paste wax here and there. But it's more of the same. Put it in, and this thing it takes a lot of force in order to actually crank this. You want to make sure you start it nice and straight. That was not nice and straight. Let's try that. Yeah, that's nice and straight. Now this thing is going to jam up and get really tight really fast, and so you got to work it a little ways and then work it in. So just like a normal tap, you got to go back and forth, and you're going to have a tendency, you're going to want to then go and get a bar and stick it on here, but you're probably just going to bend the shaft. Don't ask me how I know that. Now for the nuts, I want to make basically a nut, but have these wings on it so I can grab it and turn it a little bit. One of the key things is that the nut needs to have enough space so that the wing doesn't come down and hit the stretcher here. So I don't want the nut to be anything more than 8 inches because I had 4 inches from center to here. So I'm actually going to make it at 7 inches so there's a 1/2 inch top and bottom. The longer you make these wings, the more torque you can put onto it, but in all honesty, you don't need that much torque at all. Just a light tweaking, you could probably just do it without the nut and not have these wings at all. I just like the wings, they add a little bit of flair to it. This is where you can put a little bit of creativity into your design. I started off by just drawing a hole that was 1.5 inches that kind of shows me what is the inside diameter of this. And then I came out and drew a line that was 1.25 inches away from that hole all the way around. So that gave me the outside diameter of the circle. From that, then I could then step off where it comes around this so that I have 6 equal segments all the way around the circle. I connect the dots and I have my hexagon. Then with the points on the hexagon, I can draw out these wings and make them however long I need them to be. This is just the shape I want to do. This is where you can use your creativity and come up with something you like. If you like something that's kind of swirly or shaped weird. I did one of these for my Moxon vise where it's completely rounded. I did one for the kids vise where they have these little swirl figures on either side. So have a little bit of fun and experiment and do it whatever way you want. I'm kind of interested in trying making more of this square blocky design. It should make it a lot easier because I can just cut down each shape and size and get a really nice clean cut right off the saw. A little bit quicker, a little bit easier. Also, you'll notice that I'm using black walnut in this. I have this scrap piece here that works out perfectly for me. I was going to make it out of hickory, but when cutting the threads in the hickory, that took a lot more work than I was expecting. It works, and not too huge an issue, but the walnut will cut the threads a lot easier. And as these are going to be glued onto the screws, there isn't going to be much need for, well, stiffness. So basically I'm just going to chop away at this. I'm going to cut it lengthwise. I'm going to cut it at either end, and then that will allow me to cut in here and cut in here, and then I can extend the lines and cut out here and cut out here. And I'm just going to take you through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut them to length. Now, before I go any further in cutting this all out, the next thing I want to do is actually drill the hole all the way through. So I'm going to use the brace and bit and cut out the same hole. This is the same saw that was used for cutting the threads on the back of the vertical. So I'm going to drill through there and then tap that out. So let's have a little bit of fun. So when tapping it, it's very important to start the tap off nice and plumb to the surface. We want it square and plumb. I don't want this wobbling around. That way when the nut actually cuts, it is flat to the surface. Now thankfully, eyeball is good enough. No reason to pull out a square. You can fairly easily see if it is plumb enough. So a lot of little back and forth, but thankfully walnut is far easier to tap than hickory. Every now and then it gets a little tight and you can jam it up. What you can do is push the stick and push all of the detritus that's been knocking out through these vents so you don't have to back it out all the way to clean it out. Okay, now that we've tapped the hole, I want to cut down either side of the arms all the way down to the hexagon lines. So I'm going to start by drawing lines across the top so I get a really nice square cut coming down. And then I'm going to cut down these hexagon lines and bring you back for the next step. So the next cut, once we've cut all these down here, is we want to cut down these sides. So I'm going to use a square and extend these lines all the way out to the sides. This will let me know where to cut along that line all the way out there. And then out on this edge, I'm going to then continue those lines across so that we can cut down them easier. So then to make that cut, I put it in the vise at that angle, and I can just start it down. Just like any other line. Any line is an angle, even if it's 90 degrees. Just like that. Do it to all our four sides, and we'll have one more cut to make on each one. For that last cut on either side, I set it up so that these lines are vertical. I'm going to put my knife in that mark, put a square on it, and then use that to draw a line across the top. Do that on both sides, and then we can, just like before, cut down that line too. And cuts down it. Now to clean these up, the top surface of the nut, we can fairly easily just hit with a plane and make that really nice and smooth and ready to go. But for all the other surfaces, we're going to have to use a file. And because they're fairly smooth to begin with, it's not going to take that much to clean them up. Just like that. Now on these ends, I actually want to shape them a little bit. Rather than leaving them square, I'm going to put a really nice heavy chamfer on each end. That'll just make them look a little bit more fancy. We can come through and file it all. And give the edges a light chamfer. So for this glue up, I'm going to be using epoxy. I would normally use West System epoxy, but in this case, I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy because ain't nobody got time for that. So the epoxy is useful because it fills gaps much better than any other glue out there, and it has a much stronger bond. So I'm going to use that for this connection. So I'm going to apply a little bit to the bolts around the top, a little bit to the nuts around the bottom, then screw them on. Doesn't take too much at all, actually. The threads are fairly tight, except for the split out gap, which is fairly common. And once I have it smeared onto both, just screw it on down on. Let the epoxy fill the gaps. And then I'm going to go a little bit past where I want it to be so that it's sticking out, and then I'll plane that off smooth once it's all done. And just to kind of fill that gap, I'm going to let this all work down around there. Once that's cured and dried, I'm going to come at it with a low angle plane and smooth them down. Get a nice clean edge all the way across there. Get rid of the marks of glue. Then it's just as easy as putting it in place, cranking them down in. I made these a good bit longer than I needed to make them. Now as you can see, those are a bit long. So at this point, I'm going to come in here with a saw and I'm going to cut them off around there. Just eyeballing it. No reason to be anything particular. So now when I fit a saw in, I can slide it between the jaws, and with one hand I can tighten down just that one plate. And if I have a longer one and I need to use the other one, then at that point then I can come down here and crank down the other one. But you only need to use one or the other. And now it's ready for filing. So there you have it. We have nuts, we have bolts, we have a saw vise, we have a few other little things we need to do to finish this up and put some finish on it, but we'll get to that in the next video. I do want to say thank you to the patrons on Patreon. You guys are the reason why I can put out videos with this type of content. If you'd like to find out more about Patreon or help out with that, you can do so right down below. Also, if you'd like to subscribe, you can also see some behind the scenes footage where I put out some of the ideas of videos I have coming up and ask for some thoughts along the way. If you'd like to see that, my second channel is right over here. That's about it for today. Until next time. Have a wonderful day.